Putting somebody who was raped to death.
She killed 7 men, shot them, robbed them, left their bodies scattered across the back roads of Florida. To the world, she was pure evil, a monster behind the wheel of a stolen car. But the truth about Aileen Wuornos is far more complicated and far more disturbing. A new documentary on Netflix, Aileen Wuornos, Queen of the Serial Killers, is revisiting the case, asking questions most people thought were already answered. Was she a remorseless predator, or was she framed, manipulated, and discarded by a system that decided her guilt before she ever spoke? We'll tell you the story of a woman condemned for 7 murders, but whose truth was never fully told. To most who crossed her path, Aileen looked like no one special, just another drifter with tangled hair, a cigarette always in hand, and eyes that had seen too much. But in just 12 months, this forgotten woman would become one of the most infamous killers in American history, the so-called first female serial killer. But behind that title was a lifetime of pain, a life so brutal that it almost seemed inevitable she would one day fight back. Born in Michigan in 1956, Aileen was abandoned before her first birthday. Her mother vanished. Her father, a convicted pedophile, killed himself in prison before she could even meet him. By 11, she was being abused by family members. By 12, she was pregnant. By 15, she was living in the woods behind her grandparents' house, trading her body for food and shelter. She never had a chance. She learned early that the world was cruel, that every hand that reached out wanted something in return. So when she finally picked up a gun, it wasn't about revenge, it was about survival, or at least, that's what she told herself. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen Wuornos murdered 7 men, a salesman, a construction worker, a truck driver, a retired police officer, ordinary men who made the mistake of trusting a stranger on the side of the road. Each story ended the same: gunfire, silence, and the hum of an engine fading into the night. The press called her a monster. The public called her evil. But psychologists and filmmakers saw something else. They saw a woman built by trauma, warped by survival, and trapped in a world that never offered her mercy. And yet, her guilt wasn't simple, because when the evidence came out, the confessions, the recordings, the police manipulation, a different story began to emerge, one that still divides people to this day. During her trial, Aileen's lover, Tyria Moore, was used by investigators to coax a confession. She was told she could go free if she convinced Aileen to confess on tape.
I have to confess. Why the hell did you do this? Why did you do this? I don't know.
It worked. Aileen admitted to everything, believing she was protecting the only person she'd ever loved. But was that love or betrayal? After her first conviction, Aileen gave up. She stopped fighting. She refused appeals. She told the judge she wanted to die. And when reporters asked why, she said, "I'm tired. I just want to go home." But home was no longer a place. It was an end. Decades later, Netflix's new documentary looks again at that ending, at the strange inconsistencies in her statements, at the officers who courted Hollywood deals before she was even convicted, at the question no one dared to ask: was Aileen Wuornos a victim of her own madness or a pawn in someone else's story? Her final interview before execution was as chilling as it was tragic. She said, "I killed those men. Yes, they deserved it. I was doing God's work, and now I'll be with him." Then she smiled, the kind of smile that hides an entire lifetime of pain. What really happened on those Florida highways may never be fully known, but one truth remains. Aileen Wuornos was both the hunter and the hunted, a killer and a casualty, a mirror reflecting the darkness she came from. Tonight, we go beyond the headlines, beyond the films, beyond the myth, to uncover the real story of the woman who terrified a nation and challenged everything we think we know about evil. This is the most evil truth about Aileen Wuornos.
He was choking me and I was holding it like this. And he said, "Do you want to die, slut?"
The first gunshot always echoes the longest, not because it's the loudest, but because it marks the moment when there's no turning back. It was the 1st of December, 1989. The Florida sun was low, the wind was sharp, and the roads near Daytona Beach stretched quiet and empty. Aileen Wuornos stood by the edge of Highway 1, a hitchhiker waiting for mercy in a world that had never shown her any. Her jacket was torn, her boots were thin, She was 33 years old and already looked twice that. For years, she had survived by selling her body to men passing through, trading warmth for money, affection for survival. It wasn't dignity, but it was life. And then a car slowed down, a silver Cadillac. Behind the wheel was Richard Mallory. He was 51, the owner of a small electronics repair shop in Clearwater, a man with quiet manners, thin hair, and eyes that never seemed to rest. To strangers, he looked harmless, a lonely man offering a ride to a woman who needed one. But Mallory carried his own darkness. He had served 10 years in prison for sexual assault, the kind of detail no one knew that night, and one that would later blur the line between victim and villain. He rolled down his window, offered her a cigarette, and asked where she was headed. Aileen said she didn't know. He told her to get in, and she did. For hours they drove, talking in the rhythm of two strangers killing time. He bought her a drink. He told her he liked her smile. She laughed, but her laughter didn't sound real. She had learned long ago that laughter could buy time. At some point, they left the highway. He turned down a dirt road that cut through the trees, a stretch of land so quiet the only sound was the hum of insects. They stopped. He told her he wanted to have sex. She agreed, as she always did. But according to her, what happened next was different. In her later confessions, Aileen said that Mallory tied her hands, that he raped her, beat her, threatened to kill her, that when she broke free, she grabbed her .22 caliber pistol and fired. She said she shot him in self-defense, that it was him or her, but the truth, the real, unflinching truth, is buried somewhere between her story and the evidence. Investigators later found Mallory's body miles away from his car, naked, riddled with bullets, 2 shots to the chest, 2 more as he tried to crawl away. There were no signs of a struggle, no bindings, no defensive wounds, only silence. His car was discovered a few days later, abandoned in a remote area. Everything of value was gone: his wallet, his tools, his camera. Inside the vehicle, police found a single palm print. It belonged to her. Aileen and her girlfriend, Tyria Moore, were seen driving the Cadillac around Daytona Beach. They used Mallory's credit cards, pawned his belongings, and drank away the profits, 2 women laughing in a bar while a man's body lay in the woods. When detectives later asked her about him, Aileen said only this: "He was gonna hurt me. I stopped him first." To the world, that sounded like justification, but to psychologists, it sounded like projection, a lifetime of pain aimed at one man who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Richard Mallory's murder would be the first in a line of 7, and while his death began as tragedy, it became something much bigger, the spark that ignited a year of blood. In the weeks that followed, Aileen couldn't stop talking about him, not with guilt, but with pride. She told Tyria, "He was gonna rape me, but I took care of it." And in those words, you can hear her transformation beginning, the victim turning into the predator, the prey learning to hunt. The media would later call her America's first female serial killer. But in that first moment, there was nothing planned about it. It was chaos, born from fury and fear. Yet once she realized how easy it was to make a man disappear, it stopped being fear and started becoming control. For most killers, the first murder is followed by regret, sleepless nights, a sense of collapse. For Aileen, it was followed by calm. The silence after the gunfire was the first peace she'd ever known. In prison, she would later describe that feeling with unsettling clarity. She said, "When I pulled the trigger, I felt like God was there with me, like he was saying, 'It's okay, Lee. You're safe now.'" That was how she justified it, not as murder, but as mercy. A mercy she believed no one had ever shown her. But that kind of mercy always demands more blood. By Christmas, she and Tyria had spent the last of Mallory's money. The Cadillac had been sold for scrap. The laughter had faded, and the hunger returned. She picked up her gun again, tucked it beneath her jacket, and stepped back onto the road. The sun rose over the Florida pines, and another car slowed to a stop. The driver was a construction worker named David Spears. And for Aileen Wuornos, the first gunshot had already written the rest of the story. 6 months had passed since the murder of Richard Mallory, but the silence that followed hadn't brought peace. It had brought hunger. Aileen Wuornos was still walking the highways, still thumbing for rides beneath the Florida sun, still chasing the one thing she'd never had: control. By May of 1990, the air was thick with heat, and Aileen was running out of money again. The small jobs, the stolen cars, the pawned jewelry, it was all gone. The motel rooms she shared with Tyria Moore were getting smaller, the arguments louder, and the gun never left her side. That was when she met David Spears. He was 47 years old, a construction worker from Winter Garden, Florida. Tall, lean, tanned by the sun, and worn by work. He was engaged, a quiet man who fixed things with his hands and believed that good people didn't need to fear the world. He was wrong. On the morning of May the 18th, David left home early in his pickup truck. He told his fiancée he was heading to Orlando for a quick job. She watched him drive away, not knowing it would be the last time she saw him. Somewhere along Highway 19, he slowed for a hitchhiker. A small woman, dirty from the road, hair wild, eyes sharp. She smiled, and he stopped. That was how it always began. Aileen climbed into his truck, tossed her bag on the floor, and thanked him. They talked about the heat, about work, about nothing. She said she was heading north. He said he could take her part of the way. Later, she would claim that he became aggressive, that he tried to assault her, that she fought back, that the gun went off in panic. But investigators never found signs of a struggle. No torn clothes, no bindings, no bruises. Only 6 bullets, each one deliberate. When David's body was found 2 days later, it was naked, lying among the brush off Highway 19 in Citrus County. The autopsy showed 6 gunshot wounds, 2 to the chest, 1 through the spine, another through the lung. He had been shot as he tried to crawl away. The brutality was cold, calculated, not survival, execution. When Aileen spoke about it later, her tone was flat. She said, "He was going to do something bad. I just stopped him first." Then she laughed. A low, dry laugh that didn't sound like guilt. It sounded like relief. After the killing, she drove his truck for days. She and Tyria stayed at a motel, drinking beer and celebrating like they had won something. She pawned his wedding ring, his tools, his watch, leaving a paper trail she wouldn't escape for long. For Aileen, the murder wasn't about money, it was about equilibrium. Her life had been a scale that never balanced. Every man she killed tipped that scale a little closer to even, or so she told herself. Psychologists later called it projected retribution. Each victim wasn't a person, but a symbol, a stand-in for every man who had ever hurt her, used her, abandoned her. David Spears just happened to be the next in line. But this time, the police began to notice. Captain Steve Binigar of the Florida Bureau of Law Enforcement saw the pattern forming. 2 dead men, both found naked, both shot with a .22 caliber pistol. The bullets were identical, the wounds were identical. Someone was hunting, yet no one imagined it was a woman. The idea was almost laughable at the time. A female serial killer? It didn't fit the mold. The world wasn't ready for that kind of evil-wearing mascara. Aileen's spiral deepened. The thrill of killing had replaced the fear. The quiet after each shot had become her sanctuary. For the first time in her life, she was the one deciding who lived and who died. And that illusion of power was the closest thing she'd ever had to freedom. Tyria, however, was growing restless. She asked where the truck came from, where the money came from. Aileen told her to stop asking questions. She said, "You don't want to know, Ty. Trust me." But the truth was already bleeding through. Aileen's temper was explosive. She started accusing Tyria of betrayal, of plotting to leave her, of talking to the police. In reality, no one was looking for them yet, not seriously. But paranoia had begun to rot her mind. At night, she dreamed of gunfire. During the day, she walked the highways with her revolver tucked into her jacket, searching for the next face that reminded her of the past. When detectives later compiled her timeline, they noticed how quickly the intervals between murders were shrinking. The gap between Richard Mallory and David Spears had been 6 months. The next one would take only 3 weeks. David's fiancée never recovered. She kept his photograph framed beside the bed for the rest of her life. When asked by a reporter what she would say to Aileen Wuornos if she ever had the chance, she said, "I'd ask her if he begged, because I hope he didn't." For Aileen, David Spears was proof that killing worked, that it silenced the fear, that it erased the memories, if only for a little while. She told Tyria one night, "I'm done being scared. If they come for me, I'll shoot them too." And Tyria didn't argue. She just stared at her and saw what Aileen herself could not. That the woman she loved was already gone. By early June, Aileen was back on the road, thumb out, eyes hollow, heart empty. She was no longer hunting for survival. She was hunting for release. And when the next car slowed down, with a quiet man behind the wheel, a rodeo worker named Charles Carskadden, Aileen smiled because she already knew how this story would end.
I guess not. All they were was shot and left.
The summer heat in Florida is different. It doesn't just burn, it lingers, a heavy, suffocating blanket that presses down on the skin and makes every breath feel like work. By June of 1990, that heat was closing in on Aileen Wuornos, and so was her hunger. She had already killed twice, and each time, the silence that followed the gunfire had made her feel invincible. But invincibility fades quickly when the money runs out. It was on June the 31st when she met Charles Carskadden. He was 40 years old, a part-time rodeo worker, the kind of man who lived paycheck to paycheck but still smiled easily. He was traveling across Florida for work, his truck loaded with supplies and the smell of dust and leather. To most, he was an ordinary man on an ordinary road. But that afternoon, he stopped for the wrong hitchhiker. She stood by the shoulder of Highway 19, hair tangled, thumb out, gun hidden in her bag. When he pulled over, she grinned, and that grin was all it took. They drove for a while. Aileen knew exactly how to play the part, the lonely traveler, the small talk, the broken story about a life that never quite worked out. Charles listened. He was polite. Maybe he even felt sorry for her. But pity, in Aileen's world, was just another reason to hate. She would later tell the police that he tried to assault her, that he made a move, that she had no choice but to shoot him, but the autopsy would prove otherwise. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of restraint, only 9 bullets. He was shot 9 times, chest, back, arm, skull, as if she wanted to erase him piece by piece. Overkill, a term investigators use when emotion outweighs logic. It meant she didn't just want him dead, she wanted him gone. His body was found near Pasco County, lying face down in the grass, his clothes missing, his pockets empty. There were tire tracks nearby leading back toward the highway. By the time police found him, the Florida sun had done its work. The body was already bloated, the wounds crawling with flies. But one thing was clear. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was execution. Afterward, Aileen and Tyria took his car and drove north. They checked into a motel, drank beer until sunrise, and pawned his possessions under a fake name. She laughed when she told Tyria what had happened. "He thought I was weak," she said. "He thought I was nothing." But in that moment, she wasn't nothing. She was judge, jury, and executioner, and the feeling was intoxicating. To outsiders, Aileen was a blur, a woman drifting from gas stations to bars, wearing the same faded jeans, living on cigarettes and rage. But inside, something was shifting. She was starting to believe her own myth. The idea that she was an avenger, a force cleansing the world of men who deserved it. Every bullet she fired was, in her mind, a form of balance. By now, the police had begun to connect the dots. The similarities were too precise to ignore. Men found naked, robbed, killed with a .22 caliber revolver, their bodies dumped near the same stretch of highway. And though investigators had no name, they had a pattern, and a shadow that seemed to move through Florida like smoke. But Aileen didn't see the pattern. She only saw the next day, the next drink, the next man to blame. Her violence wasn't strategic. It was survival repackaged as purpose. And the more she killed, the less human she became. Later, when detectives showed her photos of Charles Carskadden, she shrugged. "Yeah, that one," she said. "He pissed me off." No emotion, no remorse, just indifference, as if his life were a mosquito she'd swatted away. That was her detachment, not from morality, but from memory. She had learned to forget as quickly as she pulled the trigger. It was easier that way. But for the investigators piecing it together, the picture was growing sharper. Aileen Wuornos wasn't just a drifter. She was a ghost with a gun, and she was getting closer to capture, even if she didn't know it yet. By early July, she was restless again. The money from Carskadden's death had already vanished. The motel room was empty, but for beer cans and ashtrays. Tyria wanted to leave. Aileen refused. She said, "We'll get more soon." The line between survival and compulsion was gone. On July the 31st, another man slowed for a hitchhiker. His name was Troy Burris, a husband, a father, a delivery driver who had kissed his wife goodbye that morning and promised to be home by dinner. He wouldn't be. For Aileen, it didn't matter who he was. Names didn't matter anymore. Only the moment. The silence before the shot. The calm that came after. And as the sun sank over the pines that night, she raised her gun once more, and the story continued along the same lonely road.
The principle is self-defense. They say it's the number.
July in Florida feels like walking through breath. The air itself seems alive, dense, heavy, filled with the hum of insects and the smell of wet asphalt. It's the kind of heat that keeps secrets, that hides the sound of a gunshot and swallows the echo before it reaches the trees. It was the 31st day of that month in 1990 when Troy Burris disappeared, 50 years old, a delivery driver for a sausage company in Ocala. He was a husband, a father, and the kind of man who worked hard enough to never be noticed by the world. He didn't crave excitement. He only wanted to get home by dinner. That morning, he kissed his wife, Linda, goodbye and told her he'd be back before the evening rain. He loaded his delivery truck, checked his clipboard, and began his route through the small towns that threaded Florida's center. He was seen at a rest stop just after noon, buying a soda, smiling, talking to the cashier about the heat. Then he was gone. Hours later, a coworker noticed he hadn't returned. They called his route stops. No one had seen him since midday. By nightfall, his wife called the police. She told them, "He's never late. Something's wrong." And she was right. Somewhere along Highway 19, Troy Burris saw a woman standing by the road, a hitchhiker with tangled hair, jeans streaked with dust, a small bag slung over her shoulder. Aileen Wuornos. He slowed. It was instinct, the same reflex of kindness that had doomed the others. He offered her a ride. She smiled, and he thought he was helping someone. He wasn't. They drove for miles in silence. Aileen watched the world roll past, the trees flashing like frames of a film. Her gun sat hidden in her bag, but the decision had already been made. She didn't need a reason anymore. The killing wasn't a reaction, it was routine. We don't know exactly how it happened. Whether she asked him to pull over, whether he resisted, whether she spoke before she fired. All we know is that by the time the sun went down, Troy Burris was dead. 2 bullets, one to the chest, one to the back. Both fired at close range. No defensive wounds, no struggle. Just the quiet surrender of a man who never saw it coming. His truck was found abandoned 2 days later off a dirt road in Marion County. The keys were missing. His delivery papers were scattered on the seat, and the air inside smelled of blood and dust. His body was discovered 4 days later by hunters in the woods near Ocala National Forest. He was naked, already decomposing under the summer heat. His wedding ring was gone. His pockets were empty. For investigators, the scene was familiar, eerily so. Same weapon, same pattern, same kind of man. The puzzle was starting to form, but the face of the killer was still a blur. When Aileen spoke about it later, she didn't call it murder. She called it a situation. She said, "He got rough, so I shot him." The same words she used for all of them. A script she'd memorized, rehearsed, and perfected. But behind that repetition was a growing fracture in her mind. Each death was supposed to make her feel stronger, but it only made her more desperate. Her paranoia was spreading like rust. She began sleeping with her gun in her hand, drinking until she blacked out, and whispering to Tyria that the cops were coming for them. Yet she couldn't stop. The power had become her addiction. The moment before the shot, when the world held its breath and time slowed, was the only peace she knew. It was control, pure and absolute, and it made her feel alive in a way love never had. For Tyria Moore, the reality was impossible to ignore. The stolen vehicles, the sudden money, the bloodstains on Eileen's clothes. She started asking questions. Aileen started lying, but the lies were unraveling fast. After the murder of Troy Burris, police now had something tangible, a consistent weapon, a consistent method, and a theory. A single drifter killing men across the highways of Florida. They didn't yet know her name, but they had her trail. Meanwhile, Aileen and Tyria celebrated at a roadside bar in Daytona Beach. Witnesses said they were drunk, laughing, singing along to the jukebox. Aileen bragged that she had taken care of business. No one understood what that meant. No one wanted to. For Troy's wife, Linda, The days that followed were unbearable. She sat by the phone for 4 nights, waiting for a call that would never come. When the detectives finally arrived, she already knew. She said later, "I prayed he'd died quickly. I just didn't want him to be afraid." But fear was all Aileen ever dealt in. She had learned it young, and now she passed it on. Each trigger pull was her way of saying, "You can't hurt me anymore." But every bullet only deepened the wound. The news of Burris's death brought the investigation to a boil. Police were now exchanging reports between counties. A task force was forming, and somewhere in the shadows, the name Lee, her nickname, began to circulate. But Aileen didn't notice. She was already on the move again. Back on the road, back with her gun, back in the cycle she called survival and the world called murder. And this time, the man who stopped for her wasn't just a stranger. He was one of their own, a retired police officer, a man who had spent his life protecting others, a man named Charles Dick Humphreys. By September of 1990, Florida was no longer sleeping easily. The newspapers were beginning to whisper about men vanishing along the highways, drivers, workers, wanderers, found naked, robbed, shot, and left to rot in the woods. Each killing was sharper than the last, each crime scene colder. The pattern had become too precise to ignore, and in the eye of that storm was a woman walking alone. Her name was Aileen Wuornos, but on the road she went by Lee. The regulars at the bars in Daytona Beach knew her well. Loud voice, quick temper, a beer in one hand and a story in the other. No one took her seriously when she said she'd taken care of a few men. They thought she was bluffing. They were wrong. Her next victim would not be a drifter or a stranger passing through. He would be a man who had dedicated his life to protecting people like her. Charles Dick Humphreys was 56 years old, a retired Air Force major, a former police officer, and an investigator for the Florida Department of Health and Rehabilitative Services. He was the kind of man who believed in order, who believed in saving the broken, and who believed that no one was beyond redemption. He was wrong too. On the morning of September the 11th, he left his home in Crystal River, kissed his wife goodbye, and said he'd see her for dinner. He wore his gold wedding band, his badge, and a tie. A man of discipline, heading out for an ordinary day. He never came home. Somewhere along Highway 19, he saw a woman by the road. Small, weathered, hair bleached pale by the sun, eyes sharp but tired. She held out her thumb. He slowed and rolled down the window. Maybe she told him she was stranded. Maybe she said she just needed a lift to the next town. Whatever she said, he believed her, and for that belief, he paid with his life. Hours later, the quiet forest outside Marion County swallowed the sound of 7 gunshots. 7. 2 to the chest, 1 through the arm, 4 more scattered across the body. Each one fired at close range, each one deliberate. His body was discovered the next morning by a fisherman who thought he had seen a discarded mannequin in the brush. It was Charles Humphreys, naked, face down, his badge and identification lying a few feet away. His car was gone. The sight horrified investigators. The brutality was escalating. The precision was undeniable. This was not a robbery that turned violent. This was ritual. By this time, the task force investigating the murders had gathered enough evidence to suspect a serial killer. What they didn't suspect was that it was a woman. That idea didn't fit the narrative. It didn't fit the profile. It didn't fit the world's definition of evil. When Aileen was later questioned about Humphreys, she said her usual line, "He tried to rape me, so I shot him." But this time, the excuse rang hollow. There were no signs of assault, no sign of struggle. The first bullet had been fired from less than 2 feet away. He hadn't even raised his hands. Psychologists who later studied her case believed this murder marked a shift. The others may have been wrapped in self-deception, half survival, half vengeance. But this one was power. By killing a man who embodied authority, she was symbolically killing everyone who had ever told her no. Every cop, every judge, every father figure. She wasn't running anymore. She was fighting back, even if the fight existed only in her mind. After the shooting, she drove his car for several days. Witnesses saw her and Tyria Moore laughing at bars, spending cash, drinking heavily. They pawned his watch, his ring, his tools. She joked that she'd found herself a sugar daddy. But the laughter always faded quickly. When the alcohol wore off, so did the illusion of control. By mid-September, the police had matched ballistics between Humphreys and the earlier victims. They knew the same .22 caliber revolver was responsible. The net was tightening, and Aileen could feel it. Tyria wanted to leave. She told Aileen she was scared, that the news was talking about the murders now. Aileen snapped, screaming that no one would take her alive. She said, "If they want me, they better be ready to die too." That night, she cleaned her gun, wiped it down with a rag, and stared into the barrel for a long time. Then she smiled. A small, strange smile, half defiance, half exhaustion. Humphreys' death hit the public harder than any of the previous murders. A lawman killed on his way to work. It was too much for Florida to ignore. His wife, a woman of quiet dignity, said she wanted justice but no revenge. He helped people, she told reporters. He tried to make the world better, and that's what she took from him. The murder of Charles Humphreys wasn't just another crime. It was the moment the world started to pay attention. Because if a man like him could die like that, no one was safe. But for Aileen, the storm was still building. Every death brought her closer to the end, and she could feel it. She told Tyria she wanted to stop, but the road kept calling her back. That endless ribbon of asphalt where everything she hated and everything she needed seemed to live. By October, she was wandering north again, broke, angry, drinking more than ever. And somewhere along Interstate 95, she met an old man with kind eyes and an open seat in his car. His name was Peter Seams, and when he pulled over to offer her a ride, he didn't know that she had already decided how his story would end. By June of 1990, the world had begun to notice the pattern. Bodies were appearing along the highways of northern and central Florida, each one naked, robbed, and riddled with small caliber bullets. 7 men in total, though no one knew that yet. Only the killer did. And she was still walking free. Peter Seams was 65 years old, a retired merchant seaman from Jupiter, Florida, a quiet man, devoutly religious, who spent his days volunteering at a Christian mission and helping elderly neighbors with errands. He was the kind of man who opened his door without suspicion, who saw kindness as duty, and in the end, that kindness would kill him. On the evening of June the 7th, Peter told his friends he was driving to Arkansas to visit family. He packed a few shirts, some food for the road, and a Bible that sat permanently on the passenger seat of his gold Pontiac Sunbird. He told them he'd call once he arrived. That call never came. Somewhere along Interstate 95, Peter Seams saw a woman by the road. She looked exhausted, her skin burned from the sun, her jeans torn at the knees. A hitchhiker, alone, just trying to get somewhere. Aileen Wuornos. He pulled over. She thanked him. They drove off together. It was that simple. It was always that simple. No one knows exactly where the road turned into something darker. Aileen would later say he made a move. She said he touched her leg. She said she told him to stop, and when he didn't, she fired. But police never found any sign of a struggle. No bruises, no defensive wounds, no body, because Peter Seams was never found, not even a trace. The only thing police ever recovered was his car, abandoned hundreds of miles away, in Orange Springs. The windshield was cracked, blood smeared across the dashboard, and fingerprints, 2 of them, belonging to a woman named Aileen Wuornos. Witnesses told investigators they had seen 2 women crash the car days earlier. They stumbled out, drunk or dazed, laughing. Then they ran into the woods and disappeared. Those 2 women were Aileen Wuornos and her lover, Tyria Moore. It was the first time anyone had connected her name to a vehicle belonging to a missing man. The thread had finally been pulled. For weeks afterward, Aileen moved like a ghost. She dyed her hair, changed motels, carried the gun wherever she went. She told Tyria that the world was closing in, that God was testing her, that every man who picked her up was sent to harm her. She was unraveling, and she knew it. The killing of Peter Seams was different from the others in one crucial way. It was the beginning of the end. The crash, the fingerprints, the witnesses, they had all left evidence. Evidence she couldn't erase. For the first time, the police had a face to chase. Meanwhile, Peter's family began to call the authorities, worried when days passed without word. His neighbors told them he was too careful to just vanish. When the news finally came that his car had been found, his daughter said quietly, "I just want to bring my father home." She never did. Aileen pawned several of Peter's belongings, signing her name under a fake alias in her jagged handwriting. It didn't matter. Every lie she told was another thread of the noose tightening around her neck. But in her own mind, Aileen wasn't panicking. She was prophesying. She believed God was guiding her, that every man she killed had been chosen for her to destroy. To her, it wasn't murder, it was divine punishment. She told Tyria, "They're all evil. God wants them gone." But by then, the evil wasn't around her. It was inside her. For the investigators now comparing fingerprints and pawn slips, the picture was forming clearly. Aileen Wuornos was the name that kept appearing. Her criminal record stretched back years. Assault, theft, weapons charges. A violent drifter, a prostitute who lived off the edge of society, and now, possibly, a serial killer. As the investigation gained speed, Aileen's world began to collapse. Money was running out. Tyria was terrified. The bars where they once laughed were now filled with whispers. Locals recognized their faces from the wanted sketches, and Aileen could feel the end closing in. But instead of stopping, she doubled down. Her logic had twisted so far inward that each new murder felt like a way to survive the last. Every pull of the trigger was both an ending and a beginning. In the years after her arrest, Aileen rarely spoke about Peter Seams. When reporters asked, she said, "He was an old man. I don't remember what happened. I just remember his car." Then she laughed, a laugh so dry and hollow that even the guards flinched. But behind that laughter was the sound of her undoing. Because for all her bravado, she knew the police were coming. She could feel the net tightening around her life. The evidence she left in that gold Pontiac would follow her to the death chamber. And as the summer turned to autumn, the weight of her paranoia grew unbearable. She drank more, fought more, cried more. And still, she walked the highways. Gun always ready, eyes always searching. Her next victim wasn't a stranger or a drifter. He was a man who wore a badge. A man who had once served the law. A man who stopped to help a woman and never went home again. His name was Walter Antonio, and his death would mark the end of her road. By November of 1990, Florida was holding its breath. For almost a year, a nameless killer had been haunting its highways. 7 men dead, their bodies found in ditches and woods, each one stripped, shot, and abandoned. The police had a pattern, but they didn't have a name, not yet. And still, Aileen Wuornos walked. She moved like a shadow, from bar to bar, motel to motel, always carrying her revolver, always scanning for danger that wasn't there. Her mind was fracturing under the weight of her own violence. Every man she met looked like the next threat. Every smile felt like mockery. Every kindness felt like a lie. Her world had become smaller. Just the gun, the road, and the ghosts she'd made along the way. That's when she met Walter Antonio. He was 60 years old, a truck driver and part-time security guard from Merritt Island. He was a father, a veteran, and a man who had spent his life surviving by instinct. But even good instincts fail when you meet someone whose soul has already given up. It was the 19th of November. Aileen was walking near Highway 19, her jeans soaked from rain, her face drawn and pale. She had been fighting with Tyria again, about money, about leaving, about the voices Aileen swore she heard at night. She said the dead were following her, that they whispered to her from the trees, that they wanted more blood. Walter's car slowed beside her. He rolled down the window, asked if she needed help. She smiled and said she was heading south. He told her to hop in. She did. The drive was quiet at first. She told him her name was Lee. He told her he worked long hours hauling freight. He said he was tired. He said he'd been lonely. She told him she understood, and maybe, for a few minutes, she did. But loneliness can turn quickly to fear when Aileen Wuornos is in the passenger seat. Later she would say he came on too strong, that he tried something, that she had no choice but to defend herself. It was the same story she told about all of them, but the evidence told a different story. Walter Antonio was found days later in a shallow clearing off a dirt road in Dixie County. He'd been shot 4 times, 2 to the back, 2 to the head. His body was naked. His clothes were scattered nearby. The position of the wounds told investigators he'd been running when she fired. His car was discovered later that week in a remote part of Marion County, abandoned and stripped of valuables. The fingerprints inside matched Aileen's. The crime scene had a cold efficiency. No hesitation, no sign of panic. By now, she had perfected her process. Approach, charm, shoot, rob, disappear. But this murder felt different, final, not just for him, for her. Something inside Aileen broke that night. After the shooting, she wandered into a bar and drank alone. Witnesses said she talked to herself, mumbling about God, about demons, about finishing the job. She told one man at the counter, "They won't stop me. I'm chosen." Her delusions had become her only company. By this point, the Florida task force had pieced together nearly everything. The pawn shop records showed a woman selling men's belongings under different names. The crash of Peter Seams's car had left fingerprints. The descriptions from witnesses pointed to a small, blonde woman traveling with another woman who kept quiet and afraid. Police began circulating sketches. The name Aileen Carol Wuornos was finally attached to the nightmare. She had nowhere left to run. When she killed Walter Antonio, she crossed the final invisible line between vengeance and madness. Her story had started as one of self-defense, a woman fighting back against men who hurt her. But by this point, the men didn't matter. It wasn't revenge anymore, it was compulsion. An endless echo of the first gunshot. And yet, there was still a strange humanity buried deep inside her. When she pawned Walter's belongings, she hesitated before signing the slip. As if for a brief moment, she understood what she had become. Then she pressed the pen to the paper and wrote her alias, Lee Blahovec. Days later, she stood outside a convenience store, staring at the sky and whispered, "I'm tired." When investigators finally arrested her weeks later, it was in a biker bar in Volusia County. She didn't fight, didn't run, didn't plead. She simply said, "I know what this is about." In her eyes, you could see the fatigue of a life spent fighting ghosts. The last of her 7 victims had been buried, but the war inside her had only just begun. For the families, the news brought closure. For the police, it brought relief. For Aileen, it brought silence. The road had ended, the gun was gone, the highway was empty, and all that was left was judgment. But even in judgment, the question would remain. Was she a murderer born from evil, or a woman built by cruelty? That question would follow her into the courtroom, into the interviews, into the documentaries, and into death itself. Because for Aileen Wuornos, the story didn't end with the final bullet. It ended in chains, and on camera. When the road finally ended, it didn't end in a gunfight. It ended quietly, under a pale Florida sky.
What I did was what anybody else would do. I defended myself.
Aileen Wuornos, the woman who had haunted the highways for nearly a year, was sitting alone at the Last Resort bar in Volusia County. It was dry and windless, the kind of day where even the air felt tense. She wasn't hiding, she was waiting, a cup of coffee in front of her, a cigarette burning low between her fingers. Outside, the unmarked cars rolled up. Officers stepped out, slowly, hands near their weapons, ready for the monster they'd been chasing. But there was no fight, no scene, no resistance. When they surrounded her table, Aileen looked up and said, "I know what this is about." That was it. After 7 murders, the hunt was over. The police had what they needed: ballistics, pawn slips, fingerprints, witness statements, each piece of evidence traced back to her. But what they wanted most was her voice on record. They wanted her confession, and for that, they needed help from the one person she still trusted, Tyria Moore. Tyria had fled Florida months earlier. She was terrified that she'd be arrested as an accomplice. Detectives tracked her to Pennsylvania and made her an offer, help them get a confession, and she would be free. She agreed. Over 3 long days, Tyria called Aileen at the jail. The calls were recorded. Her voice trembled as she begged Aileen to clear her name. Aileen hesitated. You can hear it in the tapes, the fear, the confusion, the love. Then finally, her voice cracked. She said, "I did it, Ty. I killed them. Every one of them. But I did it for me and you." It was over. The confession was complete. Love had been turned into evidence. Aileen was charged first with the murder of Richard Mallory, the first man she killed. The others would follow later, but that single case was enough to condemn her. Her trial began in January of 1992. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, cameras, spectators. The world's fascination with the female serial killer had begun. The prosecution called her a predator. They said she seduced men, robbed them, and executed them. They painted her as cold, deliberate, beyond saving. The defense tried to show another woman, one shattered by years of abuse, neglect, and sexual violence. They said she was a victim of a lifetime of cruelty who finally broke, but the jury didn't see a victim. They saw a pattern. 7 dead men, the same weapon, the same method. It didn't take them long. When the verdict was read, guilty of first-degree murder, Aileen didn't flinch. When asked if she wanted to speak, she said, "I was raped. You're killing a raped woman. But go ahead. I hope you get a bullet too." She was sentenced to death. After that, something inside her broke for good. She refused to attend most of her later trials. She waived her right to appeal. She told her lawyers to stop fighting. She said she wanted to die. "I'm tired," she told a reporter. "I'm sick of this earth." In letters from prison, she described the courtroom as a circus. She wrote that everyone was in it for fame. The police, the lawyers, even the media. She believed they were using her story for money and attention. In one interview, she claimed the police had known she was killing men and let her continue so they could sell movie rights later. It sounded paranoid, but the irony was that by then, studios really were circling her story. Her mind unraveled slowly under the fluorescent lights of death row. She stopped sleeping. She accused the guards of spitting in her food. She said the prison was bombarding her with sonic pressure. She talked about God, about aliens, about the apocalypse. Her eyes grew hollow. Her voice grew cold. The rage that once drove her had turned into something else, a kind of quiet, inevitable madness. When her lawyers begged her to appeal the sentence, she refused again. "I want the chair," she said. "I'd rather be dead than stay here." She had already been sentenced to death 6 times for the 6 other murders, but she didn't contest them. She didn't even attend every hearing. She pleaded guilty without emotion, as if each death sentence was one step closer to peace. When her last appeal was denied in 1996, she smiled and said, "Good, let's get it done." Years later, in her final interview before execution, Aileen looked into the camera and said something that froze the room.
And I got to come clean that I killed those 7 men in first-degree murder and robbery.
Her words were clear, but her eyes were not. They flickered with a strange mix of fury and calm, like she had already left this world in her mind. Even those closest to her couldn't decide what was real anymore. Was she confessing, performing, or simply trying to die faster? When asked what her life had meant, she paused. Then she smiled, small, tired, real, and said, "Just a wasted life." It was the truest thing she ever said, because for all the blood, for all the horror, the story of Aileen Wuornos wasn't just about the men she killed. It was about the girl she once was, abandoned, abused, forgotten, and how, in the end, she became exactly what the world expected her to be. The highway is quiet now. The cars still pass, the sun still burns over the asphalt, but the ghosts have faded. Only the wind remembers the sound of those gunshots, the echo of 7 lives that ended on the lonely roads of Florida. Aileen Wuornos was executed on October the 9th, 2002. She was 46 years old. When asked for her final words, she said, "Yes, I would just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus." Then she smiled, and that was the last anyone ever heard from her. The world called her a monster. The media turned her into a headline. Hollywood turned her into a myth. But beneath it all, she was something far more human, a reflection of what happens when pain goes unanswered for too long. Some say she was born evil, others believe she was made that way. Maybe both are true, maybe neither. What's certain is that by the time Aileen pulled the trigger for the first time, the woman she might have been was already gone. She grew up surrounded by violence, and she learned that violence was the only language that ever listened. The road didn't corrupt her, it simply gave her a stage. And when the world ignored her screams, she answered back with a gun. There's no way to justify what she did. 7 men dead, 7 families broken. But there's also no way to ignore what made her. The cruelty of neglect. The silence of those who could have stopped it. The way society only noticed her after she started to kill. Maybe that's the most haunting part of her story, that if someone had shown her kindness before the darkness took hold, this road might never have been paved in blood. Her story reminds us that monsters don't appear from nowhere. They are built, layer by layer, scar by scar, until there's nothing left but rage. Aileen Wuornos wasn't the first person to kill out of fear, and she won't be the last. But she stands as a warning, a reflection in the mirror of what happens when humanity forgets its own. If you drive down Highway 19 today, you'll see trees reclaiming the edges, grass pushing through cracks in the pavement. The earth has healed, but the memory still lingers. Because evil, once born, never truly dies. It waits, it listens, it learns, and sometimes it smiles. A story of pain, power, and the cost of survival. If this story made you stop and think, subscribe for more. Not for the blood, not for the horror, but for the truth hiding behind it. Because every crime tells us something about ourselves. And sometimes, listening to the darkness is the only way to understand the light.